Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent read for 6 books. The first is Rituals by the Dutch author Cees Nooteboom, translated from the Dutch by Adair Dixon. Then the Spanish author Javier Marias, The Infatuations, and this was translated by Margaret Krajl Costa. And then 2 books I was sent by the publishers Corona Samizdat, who are going to publish who have published my next book. More of which in the next video. But these 2 books are the American author Harsch, The Skulls of Istria, and the Slovenian writer Dimitrij Krajl. It's called The Lift. I don't know if this has a translator or if Krajl himself translated it. Jennifer Egan's debut novel, The Invisible Circus. And finally, Gilbert Adair's Love and Death on Long Island. So I'm going to start with a Nooteboom. This is the second Nooteboom book I've read, and he's rapidly becoming one of my favourite authors. I think he's still alive. In 2021, a journal of his was published, so I think he's still going. And he does seem to write a lot about place and sort of travel writing, really. So I'm not sure how many more actual out-and-out novels of his I've got to go, but I'll certainly be looking into it. So this is a book in 3 parts, and they each are set against a historical context, but the historical contexts are very much a framework, literally like a frame around a painting. They're not sort of key to the what's going on. So the first part is called Intermezzo and takes place in 1963. The second is and the assassination of JFK. The second is called Arnold Todd's and takes place in 1953. I can't remember what the historical background of that one was. And then the third is called Philip Todd's, 1973, which takes place against the OPEC oil crisis and the sort of pressure that put on the global economy, particularly in Europe. And just to say that Arnold Todd's is the father and Philip Todd's is the son, and they are both people that the protagonist meets. So Intermezzo, which starts it, sees the protagonist who is a bit of a wastrel, is not really making the most of his talents. He does a bit of this, a bit of that, and one of the things he does is he writes horoscopes, which, as we know, is a load of sort of bunkum that you just dream off the top of your head. And he's always sort of idly speculated about writing his own horoscope, which would say, your wife left you today, and you could go on to commit suicide. And indeed, there are sort of planned deaths throughout each of the 3. It's worth saying, obviously, since the protagonist is the one who goes through parts 2 and part 3, that his suicide attempt is unsuccessful, but there is an attempt. And although it's sort of about suicide, it's not a gloomy book at all, really. So don't be put off by that. So part 1 is really us getting to know the protagonist, his relationship to his Namibian wife. I think Namibia was a former Dutch colony in the same way as, because it's next door to South Africa, which obviously was colonised by the Dutch in the form of the Boers. And it's really sort of how he sort of scuppers his own marriage through infidelity, not only infidelity but sleeping with whores, how he's not really making the most of his talents, as I say. In a way, it's the least interesting of the 3 parts, because it's when he meets I can't remember the guy's first name, Arnold Todd's, and then Philip Todd's in parts 2 and parts 3, that it gets much more interesting, where he's very much sort of listening and receiving, and we get introduction to these 2 fascinating characters of the 2 Todds. I mean, Philip has never really met his father. He was abandoned by him from an early age, so is not even aware. It's only the protagonist who makes the link between the 2 of them. But as I say, they're both fascinating characters, and they're both, like the protagonist, outsiders. They don't fit into society, and they've both chosen rather different hermit lifestyles. And the protagonist basically has been cheated out of money by his family, out of an inheritance, and he's taken by an aunt to meet this Arnold Todd's, who says straight away, I'll get you your money, don't worry. And Todd's isn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing it because he wants to sort of screw over the family. But as they sort of fall into conversation and they get to know one another, Todd's gives him his worldview, which is how he has, stepped back from Catholicism, sort of rejected religion, into a sort of it's sort of an existentialism, but it's a curious take on existentialism. It's just, I'm not doing justice to this, but it's brilliant. So I just wanted to read this, just give you an idea of the style, because it creeps up on you. It's very not showy writing, and all of a sudden it will just explode like this. I don't know, perhaps I never did believe, he shouted ahead. The scornful laugh of a magpie replied, and suddenly the whole wood was full of church fathers, inquisitors, martyrs, confessors, agnostics, heathens, philosophers, bleaters and brayers. Theological arguments flew all around. 2 finches were discussing the Council of Trent. A cuckoo underlined the Summa Theologica. A woodpecker endorsed the 31 Articles. And sparrows condemned Hus to the stake once again. Spinoza the heron, Calvin the crow, the incomprehensible cooing of the Spanish mystics, the chirping, twittering, gurgling and clucking birds of field and woodland celebrated the 2 bloody millennia of church history. From the first swimming fishes scratched on the dark walls of the catacombs to the spirit that had singed St. Paul in the guise of an inhabitant of Nagasaki. From the perplexity of the men of Emmaus to the infallible vicar occupying the sea of the fishermen. Oceans of that same human blood had been shed since then, and millions of times that same body had been consumed. Not an hour, not a day went by without being done at the North Pole, in Burma, Tokyo and Namibia, O Zeta. Even at the moment when these 2 unbelievers are walking here under the lime trees, one with his head full of Sartre, the other with his head full of nothing. And chalices and cups are very significant in this book. In this case, obviously, it's the drinking the chalice of wine in the communion, the blood of Christ. Literally gets sort of a double exposure here, because an elderly priest who the protagonist was serving as an altar boy in his youth keels over and dies, and sort of splits his head open in the fall, and his blood mixes with the communal wine and stuff. So chalices are very significant here. But it's, as I say, I'm not sure I can really do justice to this extraordinary character. Hermit, he has one eye, he lives with his dog. It all sounds very most unprepossessing, but his philosophy makes for fascinating reading. He's not a character I've come across in books before. And then we go to part 3 with his son, who he, as I say, he never really knew. And his son also is withdrawing from the world, but he's taken the Eastern mysticism route. And his chalice is the sort of ritualistic bowl for the Japanese tea ceremony. And this guy is not participating in the world, he doesn't have the money, and he keeps going to this Orientalist art gallery, where this guy has this sort of ancient Japanese tea bowl, and that's where the protagonist bumps into him, because he's gone there to get a couple of prints, valued. Have they been good buys? Has he sort of lucked onto a bit of a winner or a tickle, as we say in the UK? And again, gets to he makes the connection between the father and the son, and the father by this time has died in exactly the way he predicted. The son wants to die in a sort of way of sort of meditating himself to death. He wants to escape his body into the great cosmos. So again, he's predicted his own death, like his father, and like the protagonist almost did in part 1. And again, I can't really give spoilers, but I just want to give you the start to this 3rd section, because I think it says something quite sort of significant, really. There were days, thought Innie, when it seemed as if a recurrent, fairly absurd phenomenon were trying to prove that the world is an absurdity that can best be approached with nonchalance, because life would otherwise be unbearable. There were days, for instance, when you kept meeting cripples, days with too many blind people, days when you saw 3 times in succession a left shoe lying by the roadside. It seemed as if all these things were trying to mean something but could not. They left only a vague sense of unease, as if somewhere there existed a dark plan for the world that allowed itself to be hinted at only in this clumsy way. So I think that's a really interesting little meditation on sort of pareidolia, where our tendency to seek pattern and symmetry in things that therefore bear meaning and convey messages to us. It's very much sort of quoted in is that, and the epigraph for part 3 is from Ian Kioran, who's sort of a nihilist writer. He's Romanian but from France, and that definitely sort of tinges throughout this book. But again, for every sort of downer in the book, it's balanced by an upper. So, for example, what that's referring to is 3 pigeons that the protagonist encounters on his way to this art gallery for the first time, and one has sort of flown into the windscreen of a car and killed itself, and he stops, and this woman on a bike stops, and they sort of want to give it a decent burial, and they end up sort of having sex, and he has this sort of, even on the way to having sex, he just thinks, they're both riding on the bicycle, she's behind him, he knows they're going to have sex. This is when the world seems to offer hope and make it all worth living, and yet, you've got other things, and the Philiptard says, wants to escape the world of its pleasures but also its despair. He just wants to completely be done with it. And the book is racking with these different sort of takes on life and existence all the way through. I just thought it was fabulous. 5 stars. And on to another 5-star book, Javier Marias, The Infatuations. So this is a young woman in Spain, in Madrid. She works in publishing. She really likes the lifestyle and her independence that it grants her, but she doesn't like the authors that she has to deal with. And who can blame her? I understand that totally. But in order to sort of get herself up, for the workday, on her way to the office, she stops off at this cafe every day for breakfast. And she sees this couple, a bit older than her, married couple, and she's very taken with them. They seem so at ease with each other, so in love with each other, that they just sort of calm her and sort of get her set for her work day. And then one day she notices they're not there. She's not initially troubled because, they're entitled to go on holiday, but she sees in a newspaper that the man has been stabbed to death by a homeless person on the street. And that sort of severely troubles her. And she seeks out the wife and spends one day in her company just sort of consoling her. So, they sort of vaguely recognise one another. The wife vaguely recognises her from the cafe, even though they've never spoken. So, this isn't sort of a creepy or a threat. The wife is happy to sort of unburden herself of all of her feelings. And there's a man there who was the best friend of the guy who was stabbed. And he's there to help the family out, at least in the short term, to sort of, do all the things that the husband would have done. And he sort of claims that the husband had asked him, didn't put it in the will, but had asked him this favour. As if, well, did the husband know he was going to die? Anyway, so the young woman in publishing and this guy, they hook up, they form a relationship. The young woman never calls back on the wife again, because it is such an odd thing, someone you don't know, you go and spend a day in their company and sort of provide a sort of consoling ear. And so the bulk of the book sort of transfers the focus on the relationship between the young woman and the guy who's helping the family and their relationship. He's a player, and very quickly she realises that it's just a protracted fling between them, because he is after the wife, but the wife is so sort of locked in her grief, is so attached to the ghost and the memory of her husband, that this guy knows he's going to have to wait. He's going to have to play the long game. Equally, she has a feeling that she's still in with a chance, because the wife may never come round, or she may reject this guy anyway, in which case she's the woman in place, she's the woman in the bed, as it were. And that's what this book is. Every single possible angle of motivation and psychology is rendered. Everything is considered. Because from a plot point of view, we begin to see that actually maybe this wasn't maybe this wasn't a random stabbing. Maybe there was something a little more calculated behind it. And it just keeps tweaking and twisting the plot, the motivation, and us, the reader. Keeps nudging us in a slightly different direction. And it does it in such a sort of intricate and yet full on, you know, every sort of possibility is probed in a really sort of clever way. It's not overwhelming. You know, it's quite a long book, but it keeps moving on, because it keeps moving on what's actually possibly behind all this, what's actually going on. And I'm not going to provide spoilers of where it all ends up, but it's not about grief, because if it was about grief, the wife would be the central character, and it'd be a study of her grief, but it isn't. It's about these two other characters who aren't beset by grief, but are hobbled by ghosts, the ghost of the dead husband. As I say, he can't move on the wife until she's ready to move and embrace him. And the girlfriend is still hanging on in there. So they're both, you know, because the wife won't let go, these two are sort of also snared in this sort of chain. It's like a sort of a real estate chain when you're buying a house, but you rely on everyone else, the people in the house, that they've got somewhere to move to, and where they're moving to, those people have got somewhere to move to. It's a bit like that. It's very clever. And it's just, I think what I really appreciated was the intricacy of thinking about how the people in this situation think, and the impact of being held, being restricted by other people's feelings, even if they're not directly expressed. I just thought it was very clever. 5 stars. On to Rick Harsch's The Skulls of Istria. As I say, this was sent to me by Rick himself, who runs Corona Samizdat. There's a book of his, whose title I cannot remember, that I've been highly recommended to read. It's a sort of historical journey throughout the US, and sounds brilliant. But he very kindly sent me this. So another wastrel. I described Nooteboom's protagonist as being a wastrel. This too is a wastrel, and I also have to say, when I get to Gilbert Adair, there's a wastrel at the heart of this. But this wastrel has more appeal, I think, than in Gilbert Adair's. So there's this academic in America. He's a student. He's a very gifted historian, but he can't. The problem he has is he hates academia, he hates his fellow students, he can't really bring himself, even though he's got all the talent and ability in the world, he can't bring himself to write a dissertation or a thesis. It's all a bit sort of, he's a bit too clever for his own good. It's sort of grinding him into inertia. He can't see the point of things. He has I'm not even going to call her a girlfriend, but a woman who understands, gives him the space. You know, she doesn't make demands on him. If they have sex together, that's great. If they have sex outside of their relationship, that's fine too. She's called Rosa, and in the end, he hits a scandal in America and has to flee. Otherwise, he's going to probably be jailed. And Rosa is prepared to go with him, and they end up in Slovenia, part of former Yugoslavia, where he's, in the end, he does the dirty on Rosa and leaves her for a woman from the area. And that's why I think, although he's a wastrel, and it's, you know, it's hard to like characters who are eminently dislikable, though, you know, good writing means that it's not. What's fascinating about this guy is, I think his relationships and his attitudes towards women are very richly described and very evocative, and I thought gave me a lot. So although he's a wastrel, there's still a lot surrounding him to you know, to keep you hooked, really. But he is a historian, and the book opens with him basically down a bar, just giving his life story and local history, because he's a historian. He understands the area where he finds himself, to a guy who can't even speak English. And it's one of those sort of, what you'd say are sort of a bar confessional, like Mohsin Hamid's book, The Good Terrorist. That's the framing device. And he starts off like a whirlwind, because there's a local wind to the area, which I now can't remember what it's called, but a bit like the Mistral in France or the Sirocco wind. So there's a particular wind associated with the area, which sort of not only determines the environment, what it looks like, the landscape, the architecture, the temperament of the people, but there used to be in the area a historical, I think 15th century onwards, culture called the Uskoks, who were a piratical nation, and they used to sort of predate upon people in the shipping in the Mediterranean. And that was at a time when Venice was a strong power in the region, and the Ottomans were the other strong power, and Venice and the Ottomans were, at each other. But in secret, despite their hostility, they came together because the Uskoks had sort of irritated them beyond belief, and they sort of formed a pact to deal with the Uskoks. And so the Uskoks were eventually, after a long sort of campaign, were defeated and sort of spread out and sort of eliminated, or at least sort of disappeared as a culture, as an integral culture, but remnants of it still exist amongst some of the people in the area. In that respect, it reminded me of Dictionary of the Khazars. And I found all that fascinating, and the detail in that reminded me of Matthias Enard's Zone. But the different, Zone is a brilliant book. I love Zone. It's 5 stars. But again, just to state the difference between, say, this book and Zone, which in a way are doing sort of similar themes, is that the character in Zone is brilliant on the history, but is less engaging as a character. We get less personal information other than his adventures through the Mediterranean. This guy, because we're talking about his relationships and his sort of view on life to a lesser extent, the history stuff is good, but there's much more on top of it because he's a real character, or a much more fledged character than I felt the one in Zone was. And ultimately, his story comes to a head where he has a meeting with the skulls of Istria. I will not relate and spoil what that is, but I just thought this really sort of packed a punch, and I really enjoyed this. 5 stars. And on to The Lift. This is small and perfectly formed. It's about 58 pages long, and it's as I say, it's perfectly formed. It works. It sets up its world, and it works entirely within that. I gave it 4 stars because it is very slight. But I do think it's a good read. So a man is running for a lift. He wants to go to the basement where the casino is lodged, and the guy already in the lift wants to go to the top. He says, hold the lift, hold the lift. The guy holds the lift, and even though they want to go in opposite directions, they're happy to share the lift. The doors close, push the button, nothing happens. They're trapped. And what happens is that the guy, the casino, I'm going to call him casino guy and top floor guy. Casino guy obviously starts panicking, help, how are we going to get out of this? Whereas the other guy seems very mellow and very sort of philosophical about it. Oh, this happens all the time. They discover the phone, but it's not an emergency phone. It's not connected up to anything. But top floor guy tells him what number he needs to press. He presses a number, and there indeed is a voice on the other end. But nothing happens. The lift isn't moving. They can't call for help. It is increasing panic. The other guy's increasingly just trying to sort of allay his fears. You realise that these are 2 characters in a play. That it's all been pre-scripted. The numbers on the phone are page numbers, and when you turn to the page number, so initially the first number is pressed, I think is 42. When you reach page 42, it's a recursion to what was said on whatever page referred you to page 42. It's not a travel through your own way through the book. You're not jumping through pages. But when you reach a page, you realise, oh yes, that was the button that was pushed. So there's a recursion going on here. And gradually you realise that the power lies not with the top floor guy, but with the casino guy. That he is sort of in charge of the script, and he doesn't know it. He's got to be made to understand it's a script, and he has to stick to the script. But he has much more power over the creation of that script, or the realisation of who created that script. So it reminded me of so many things. It reminded me of Beckett, both Endgame in that sort of sense of a narrow, confined space with no windows, but also Godot, the way these two sort of react to each other, sort of not really understanding their environment, and yet sort of trying to figure it out. It also reminded me of 6 Actors in Search of a Play, because these 2 characters seem to be in a play rather than being real sort of flesh and blood characters. I mean, obviously in any book, they're not real flesh and blood characters, but that sort of, fiction within a fiction, as it were. And I thought it was delicious. It was just a bit slight for me. 4 stars. It's, if you're at a loss of something, you've got a quick read. I read this in the bath in one go. I do highly recommend this. And on to Jennifer Egan's Invisible Circus. So this was her debut, and a young girl has just graduated. She's called Phoebe. This is in the 1978, and she's come from a bit of a tragic family history whereby her dad died, and her sister, who's the apple of her dad's eye, more of which in a minute, sort of ran off to Italy ran off for a tour of Europe as a hippie in the 60s with her boyfriend, and she ended up committing suicide in Italy. So that has totally wrecked the family, leaving the mother, an older brother and Phoebe, just the three of them, having to sort of pick through the bones of that. And Phoebe is very much tied to her mother's sort of apron strings, that, you know, doesn't want to sort of abandon her. But their relationship is getting increasingly fractious, more and more, to the point where they have a sort of blazing row, and Phoebe decides, in order to sort of flee the situation, she's going to retrace her sister's steps as laid out by a series of postcards that the sister had sent to them from each place they'd visited in Europe. And it's pretty obvious she's going to, you know, probe what happened to her sister. So let's return to the family dynamics, because I was troubled by these. First of all, before she goes off to Europe, you know, all of that stuff takes an age to develop and unravel, and just too long. You know, the interesting bit in theory is when she gets to Europe. But anyway, the father wanted to be an artist, but had to pay the bills for his young family, got a job with, I think, IBM, sucked out his soul, and that's eventually, the family line was that's what killed him, you know, the fact that his soul was basically toxified by working in corporate America. He did paint in his spare time, and virtually every single painting was of his oldest daughter, Faith, who's the one who ended up committing suicide in Italy. Painting after painting after painting. Now, I was troubled by that. Ostensibly, the reason given is that because the character of the sister of Faith was that she was a wild child, she'd do more and more extreme things, and by sort of capturing that spirit, this is how the father's sort of, you know, vicariously managed to preserve his own sense of sanity and, you know, sort of imbibe a sense of freedom and liberation. I didn't really buy that. I felt there was something sexual going on beneath that, but anyway, maybe that's just me. It was a very unhealthy relationship. She kept wanting to please him by doing more and more extreme things. So she was putting her life at risk, and he was indulging this. And the mother realised this and kept telling him not to keep pushing the daughter to do this. But anyway, so when he died, the daughter Faith, you know, went off the deep end because she was so sort of hopelessly entwined symbiotically with her father. In the hippie movement, she finds the closest to this sense of freedom and liberation. So she goes off to Europe with her boyfriend Wolf, and we learn exactly what that looked like when Phoebe retraces her steps 10 years later. So with Phoebe, she has experiences of her first acid trip, almost a sexual assault. She manages to escape. She finds God and then loses him again. You know, all these sort of ridiculously compressed, major life-changing things that sort of come and go depending which city she's in. I didn't really buy it. There's so much of the characterisations in here that I didn't buy, that I really struggled with. But what got really silly, I felt, was Faith was still sort of lacking that sort of, the terminus of her sort of extreme behaviour, and she sort of gets involved with the Bader-Meinhof gang, which I did not believe for a moment. I just didn't buy it, and obviously there were consequences of that, and ultimately that's what led to her suicide. I mean, it's not. There may be a few sort of bits of spoilers in this, but I'm not going to give the full detail of it. Suffice to say, I didn't buy it. Also, Phoebe, Wolf, she bumps into, she sort of discovers Wolf in Munich. She didn't know he was there. She just sort of recognised him, and he recognised her because she's the spitting image of her sister. So apart from the coincidence of that being too great, even in fiction, but okay, let's go with it. Wolf decides that he needs to join her on her quest because he's got a few unanswered questions he needs answering. And Phoebe finds herself attracted to Wolf and tries to seduce him. He pushes her away. I mean, there's an age difference. But next chapter, next city, they do get it together. And then the book stops while we have this sort of ridiculous teenage emotional first love, even though obviously for Wolf it's not first love. Again, though, slightly queasy making, because he's basically, you know, having a relationship with the spitting image of his dead girlfriend. It made me queasy. It really did. So all in all, I just didn't like this book at all. 2 stars. And I'm going to come back to The Fate of Jennifer Egan when I've reviewed this 5th one. So Love and Death on Long Island by Gilbert Adair. So it's about it's about a novelist who is a sort of middling novelist, sort of has a sort of cult following in the world of sort of high literature. He's not sort of mass market, doesn't have wide appeal. He's basically a fogey in that he's sort of attracted to the values of worlds long departed. So he's a bit of a snob. He tries not to interact with the real world that much. You know, this seems to be a theme going through the books I've read this week. And as I say, he's a wastrel. He's very blasé about his career. Yeah, I've got this talent, I've got these books under my belt. Yeah, you know, whatever. And in Escaping the Rain one day, he takes cover in a cinema and he buys a ticket to go and see a making of an E.M. Forster novel. Only, unfortunately, it's a multi-screen cinema and he's such a fogey, he's unaware such things exist. And he ends up in a sort of a teen flesh movie where he's transfixed, despite himself and despite the lugubrious nature of the movie, by this male bit part actor. And even though he was married, he's in his 50s, his wife has died now, his whole world is turned upside down as he becomes sort of fixated on this boy, and he sort of starts going to sort of buy teen magazines to find out all about him. This kid's in America. And it seems to be a sort of a gay crush, and I'm not sure I bought it, is the problem. I'm not sure there was enough about his psychology as to, we could see sort of superficially how this boy appealed to him, but deep down in his soul, in his sense of identity, we weren't privy to any of that, and I felt that was lacking in the book. In the end, he goes over to the States to try and meet this kid. It's written with Adair's usual style. It's quite wry. It's very tidily written, but this is the 3rd Adair book I've written now, and somehow they're very small, even if they're taking on big subjects. Like the previous one of his was about the 1968 sort of political uprising in Paris, so not a small thing. But there's something slightly sort of small and unnourishing about his books, really. They're clever and they're witty and they're sort of playing games, although I couldn't quite see the game this one was playing. But they're not nourishing, so I gave this 2 stars. Okay, so just back to the Egan. So I did the what makes a great author tag, a very rare tag for me. I'll post the link to it. And although I didn't include Egan one way or the other, when I finished this book, I started thinking about Egan in the context of that tag. I love Goon Squad. I think Goon Squad is a brilliant book. Then I read The Keep, which was so-so. Then I read Look at Me, which I thought was an interesting book, but flawed. But it had some interesting ideas. And then I read Manhattan Beach, which is 2/3 of a good novel. Unfortunately, the last third just failed miserably. It was the introduction of a 3rd character, which I just didn't think the book needed at all. I thought it was working very successfully with the other 2 characters, how they sort of morphed in and out of each other's lives. And then we had The Candy House last year, which is the follow-up to Goon Squad. It's set in that same world, which I hated, absolutely hated. And I didn't like this either. Now, admittedly, I'm not aware of there being many other Egan novels for me to read. And I've already said, if her next book, as I've heard, is set also in the world of the Goon Squad, I'm not interested, because Candy House was so bad. And it suddenly occurred to me, I'm done with Egan, having read this. And what that means is, actually, I'll explain to viewers who may not be familiar with my setup, I live in a very small house. In this study I have 2 stand-up bookshelves and I have some smaller ones behind me. And these bookshelves are reserved for the books I really want close to me. What I have outside in the garden is a shed, and that's where books that I'm not that bothered about keeping near me get relegated to. It's always been a tricky thing, returning to the tag idea of good authors or favourite authors, but who have also written poor books. And this is the tipping point for me with Egan, that actually she's only written 1 book that I would want to keep near me, and the rest can all go to the shed. I know it's breaking up the integrity of my Egan collection, but I feel now she's relegated to a level where that doesn't matter. I don't need to preserve her collection together. So come with me very briefly on a journey. So here is the Egan section. Don't know how well you can see that, but I can now pull all of these, other than Goon Squad, not have them fall on the floor hopefully, and look at all that space I can reclaim. I can put, if I choose, Anne Carlson's Knox, and bring over from here other Anne Carlson novels. I can fit another one in there. I mean, I'm going to play around with this properly off camera, but as you can see, space is at a premium in these shelves. As I say, only the books I want around me, and there's sort of more of those than would fit into 2 shelves. So Jennifer Egan tomorrow, when it's light, will be sent down to the shed. So that's my recent reads wrap up. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. We're almost in March of the Mammoths. I do have a selection for that. So Matthew Sharappa's Books of the Year last year included Jeff Vandermeer's Shriek and Afterword, which sound absolutely fascinating from a sort of metafictional point of view. But it's part of a trilogy. And this is the first one, called City of Saints and Madmen. This is 705 pages, which technically doesn't quite meet Mammoth status, which is 800. But I obviously need to read part 1, I feel, before I read part 2. So I'll be reading both of these and counting it as a mammoth. So, till next time, thanks very much.